This is Stuart Gordon. I should tell you how Re-Animator came about. I was the artistic director of a theater company in Chicago called the Organic Theater, and we were a ensemble company that created original work, and through the use of a resident ensemble. And the members of the ensemble included people like Joe Mantegna and Dennis Franz from NYPD Blue, Meshack Taylor from Designing Women, and this gentleman who's on screen right here, Patrick Williams, or Ian Patrick Williams as he's called professionally. And we had been doing theater for a number of years, 10 years or more, and all of the actors in my theater kept getting cast in films, and so it seemed like a good idea that we should make a movie ourselves. And after thinking about what project to do, I was talking to a friend of mine, a guy named Bob Greenberg, who had moved out to California from Chicago, and he suggested that we do a horror film. He said that horror films were the easiest movies to raise money for because no matter how badly they turned out, if you made them for under $1 million, you would get your money back. And his advice turned out to be very, very true. So I was looking for a project that could be a good horror film. And a friend, I was talking in a conversation with a friend, and we were talking about all the vampire movies that were being made. And I expressed I suggested that why wasn't someone making a good Frankenstein film, and or putting a new spin on Frankenstein. And this friend said, well, have you ever heard of a story called Herbert West Re-Animator by H.P. Lovecraft? And I had to admit that I never had. And being a Lovecraft buff, I had to check and discovered that the only copy of this story, the story was long out of print, and the only copy existed in the public library in Chicago, in their special collections. And you had to put in a little postcard, asking for permission to look at it. And about 6 months later, I got a call or a card back from them saying that I could come down and read the story in the library. And when I got there, it was kind of like the scene in Citizen Kane. They presented me with the original pulp magazine that the Re-Animator stories had appeared in, and the pages were literally crumbling in my hands. So I asked them if I could Xerox them, and took them home and read them, and realized that this was the basis for a wonderful film. Lovecraft originally wrote it as 6 short stories that were serialized in this magazine, and they had all of the makings of a great film. Unlike most of Lovecraft's work, they were very, very specific and very action-packed. Lovecraft is a great believer in the idea of that something is too horrible to mention and leaves everything to your imagination. But in Re-Animator, he was very explicit, which is maybe the reason that Lovecraft always sort of looked down on his own Re-Animator series. Didn't think much of them because they were written for money. But that started the wheels turning, and we started developing scripts. Myself and Bill Norris, a member of the company, and Dennis Paoli. We worked on it. I did the kind of research that I normally do for a play, which would involve going to morgues and talking to people and getting research on the various ideas that were in the story, including the idea of reanimation itself. And there's Bob Greenberg's name on screen. We came up with a script. Originally, it was we thought it was going to be a television script, and then so we did it as a half an hour, and then it was expanded to an hour, and finally it was Bob Greenberg who introduced me to Brian Usna, who had put some investors together on a project, and they had the project had fallen apart, but he had the money. And I had the idea for a movie, and so I met with Brian and showed him the Re-Animator stories and showed him our hour-long script. And Brian's suggestion was that we put all of the 6 stories into it. We had just used the first 2 or 3 stories. And I said, well, what about a sequel? And he said, well, I think you should just put everything in here because you may never get a sequel. And if we're blessed with a sequel, we'll come up with some ideas for it. And so we threw all 6 stories, or as much of them as we could, into what became the screenplay for Re-Animator. This sequence here in the beginning of the film, where they are doing CPR on a patient who has gone flatline, was kind of inspired by a play that we were doing at this time, which was called ER. Not to be confused with the current television show. This was back in 1983, and we were working with a emergency room doctor, Dr. Ronald Berman, who instructed us all in CPR, and had a scene very much like this one in the play. So it seemed like a good place to start, that we were starting where Re-Animator left, or where ER had left off. And like when we did the play ER, we spent time in emergency rooms and interviewed emergency room doctors, and so it made sense to do the same thing with the pathology department and the forensic departments in the morgues of the various hospitals. And I asked Dr. Berman whether he thought that we would be able to get anybody in a morgue to talk to us. And he said, "Oh yeah, they'll all talk to you because no one ever comes down there, and they're the loneliest guys in the world," which turned out to be true. And many of the pathologists in the various Chicago hospitals were extremely helpful. And many of them, as a matter of fact, Dr. Stein of the Cook County morgue took me on a tour, which I will never forget, where he showed me more dead bodies than I had ever seen in my life. And they were stored in these plastic garbage bags that you see in this movie. Unlike the way morgues are normally portrayed in films, where people in drawers, most morgues are very much the way this one is shown here, with people in black plastic garbage bags. Because to a doctor, as soon as a person is dead, he is a piece of garbage. There's no more respect given to the body, and as a matter of fact, it's considered to be toxic, and disease-ridden. So you want to get it out of the hospital as fast as you can. And the smell is intense, which is what Bruce Abbott is playing here. Holding his breath when he goes inside here, so he doesn't have to smell this awful smell. Found myself, smelling the smell of the morgue for weeks afterwards, and maybe it was just in my mind, but it stays with you. The other thing I saw was that the dead bodies were very unlike the ones that were portrayed in movies. That they were not, in films you see people are kind of grayish white when they're dead, but the various bodies I saw in the morgue were all different colors of the rainbow. As a matter of fact, many of them were very brightly colored. Which is a thing that's called lividity, which has to do with how the blood settles in the body after a person is dead. And so you have these large purple splotches appearing where gravity has allowed the blood to settle on the bottoms of their arms and the backs of their legs and so forth. And depending on how the person has died, they can be any color from bright yellow if it's some sort of jaundice to dark purple or blue if it has to do with a pulmonary disorder. And so I felt, when I dealt with all the makeup guys, to show them all sorts of books on, pathology. And as a matter of fact, some of the pathologists that I met in the morgues had even given me slides of various bodies to use as models for some of the makeups in this movie. I have to admit that I have a very weak stomach myself, and the first time I went to one of these guys, he asked me how the various bodies, in this movie, how they had died, and I gave him a list, gun wounds to the face, motorcycle accidents, burn victims, and so on. And he said, "We'll come back tomorrow." And the next day he had a slideshow prepared for me in which all of the things that I had asked for were up on a screen, and as I walked in, there was a screen and one chair set up and a slide projector, and the nurse said, "I hope you've got a strong stomach." And after about 15 minutes, I was kind of under the seat, and I just asked the doctor if he could turn off the projector and let me just hold the slides in my hand and hold them up to the light so that I could deal with it a little bit better. But after a while, working on this film, you kind of accept these things. You get used to them. which I think is what happens to the guys in the morgue. The other thing is that I discovered about the pathologists was that they all had very, very black senses of humor, which became a part of this film as well. That I guess if you are going to keep your sanity when you're surrounded by so much death, you have to be able to laugh. Now, this sequence here between Bruce Abbott and Barbara Crampton, one of the very first scenes that we shot in the film. And I should tell you that Barbara was not the original cast member for this role. I had cast another actress for this part, and about, I guess it was 2 or 3 weeks before we were supposed to start shooting, she dropped out of the movie because I think she had talked to her mother, who said that, who had, I guess had taken a look at the script and said, "Oh no, there's no way you're going to do this movie." So we went back in and recast the role, and were lucky enough to find Barbara Crampton. And I have to say that I cannot even remember the name of the other actress. Barbara is a great actress, and a very, very brave one, obviously, as this movie shows. And we went on from this to do From Beyond, and most recently Castle Freak. And I have to say she's one of my favorite actresses. Bruce Abbott has the most difficult role in this whole movie. His character really existed as the narrator of the stories. And he is, in a sense, is the audience member. You know, he is the normal guy who's thrust into this bizarre story. And all of the other characters get to be insane and flashy, like Jeffrey Combs as Herbert West, but Bruce really is got to be the sort of the reality, the center of the film. And it's a very unrewarding role, because everybody else gets to have all these great lines, but he really is the one that holds this whole movie together. And Bruce's performance is really terrific, and very real. And he feels things. He gets upset. He asks the questions that the audience member would like to ask. I think it's important in the movies that I do to always have somebody that the audience can identify with, that the audience can sort of see the world through that character's eyes. And as you'll notice, the way this movie is shot, I'm constantly sort of perching on Bruce's shoulder, like I am here.
Yes, pretty famous. Does this building have a basement? Oh, yes. Yes. I think this will be just fine. I have my things outside. Shall I move in now?
Look.
When we started shooting the film, it was in November of 1984. And our cinematographer was a guy named Bob Ebinger. And so a lot of the sequences in the very beginning of the film are Bob's work. He, I felt, did an excellent job. But Brian Usna had made a deal with Charlie Band, about who was going to be releasing the picture. And Charlie was watching the dailies and felt that the work could be better. And so he asked us to replace Bob Ebinger with Mac Ahlberg. And Mac shot the bulk of the film. I would say probably 80% of the movie. I think Bob Ebinger shot the first week, which mainly are the scenes that take place in the apartment. But also the scenes that take place in the hospital itself, which was a hospital in Pacoima that had been damaged in an earthquake, and so was used only by movie crews from that point on. The scenes that were done in the morgue, like this one here with Dr. Hill and the autopsy, were a set that was patterned after the Cook County morgue in Chicago, of which I had a lot of pictures taken. This sequence here, where he is removing a brain, is based on all of the discussions I had with the various pathologists, and they kind of showed me step by step. It was almost like a how to do it cookbook or something. And when we originally shot this sequence, we showed every little bit of it, all of the tools, and there's a little device. I think when they cut back the tool, you'll see it. It looks sort of like almost like a corkscrew that's used for cracking open the skull after the cut is made with the bone saw. You can see it there. It's got a little, looks like a little twist top on it. And the sequence went on for about 5 minutes and was one of the most disgusting things I think ever filmed. And when we did a test screening of the movie for the Academy of Science Fiction and Horror, we realized that this scene was kind of working against us, because it just really, it was not entertaining horror. It was just sort of disgusting and kind of academic. And so this scene was cut way back. This is about the only kind of self-censorship that we did in the movie. When we made this film, we were very naive, and we believed that this movie would get an R rating. When it was presented to the ratings board, they just laughed. And after outlining the cuts to Brian Usna that would have to be made, we realized what we would end up with was about a 40-minute movie. That would be a short subject. And Brian very courageously decided to release the movie unrated, which was not done. I mean, it was of a rarity then, you know, even more so than it is today. And somehow the movie did manage to play theaters and did manage to get advertising, and it managed to make a name for itself. Now, the argument that they're having here about the 6 to 12 minute limit on brain death, again, came out of the research that we did. And it is true that what happens is if a body is, if the blood supply to the brain is cut off for that amount of time, that there's irreversible brain damage is done. Although there have been recent experiments that have been done with people who have fallen into icy water, in which they have been dead for as long as half an hour and have been revived and have been just fine. So the 6 to 12 minute limit that's referred to in the film has already been broken. One of the things we discovered in the research on the movie was that there were scientists developing fluids very much like the reanimation fluid that's shown in this, although I'm sure their stuff doesn't glow in the dark. But what you know, the attitude of the doctors is that it used to be, you know, 30 or 40 years ago, that when someone's heart stopped, that they were assumed to be dead. And then they discovered that adrenaline could start up a heart that had stopped. And so why not extend that same idea to the brain and be able to start the brain up again after it stopped? And doctors, you know, see absolutely nothing wrong with this idea. And the idea that West is doing something that is an act against God or something that is immoral is not something that a doctor would think of. I think a doctor's attitude would be that it is better to bring a person back, even if the person is messed up, than to just sit back and let them die. So that West's attitude, as is shown in this film, is really the one of most researched physicians, which is that it's better to save the patient at all costs.
No. Please.
Okay, what is it?
I don't know.
Now these scenes in the beginning of the film with Barbara and Bruce were really there to set up this normalcy, this idea of you know, this is a guy who's a bright kid who's in medical school on a scholarship, and he's in love with the dean's daughter, and he's got the whole world, you know, really at his feet, and you know, the sky's the limit, and to really get the audience on his side. As Brian remarked, none of this story would have happened if his girlfriend would have agreed to move in with him in the first place.
Haven't even heard him. Usually
But
he knocks something
it's sort of what sets all the wheels in motion here, that he takes on this weird roommate and gets drawn in to this very, very bizarre thing. But as I was saying, the dream, it would be a doctor's dream, to be able to conquer death. I mean, that's what we're, all medicine is really about. So he is seduced by that dream. If West and Kane were successful in these experiments, they would be winning the Nobel Prize. They'd be on the cover of Time magazine. They would be, remembered with all of the, Louis Pasteur and all the great research, doctors of all time. So, it's the kind of thing that you could see somebody getting taken in by.
Rufus.
This shooting style here of following her down the hall was something that I kind of picked up watching movies by Kubrick. The Shining being a really good example of that. His thing about always let the camera enter the room rather than having the camera sitting inside the room, because it's the unknown that is scary, and following you over the shoulder, pushing in with the person entering the room is the way to achieve real tension. When we were working on this film, I had never made a movie before. This is my first film, and I really was approaching it as a complete, ignoramus, I think is the word we're looking for. I really knew nothing about shooting. I knew nothing about screen direction, except what I'd seen in other films. And Brian Usna and I and Mike Muskow would sit around and, with Bob Greenberg, of course, and watch horror movie after horror movie just to see the various, techniques, and to see what was, what the market would allow. And our approach was that we had to outdo all of these other films. And so we watched, George Romero and Wes Craven and Abel Ferrara's Driller Killer and a bunch of movies that I don't even remember the titles of. And the one that we watched the most was Rosemary's Baby, Polanski's film. And I have to say that a lot of the technique in Re-Animator is borrowed from Mr. Polanski. The idea that the camera is an active participant in the story, in the sense that we're kind of eavesdropping. And as you can see, here we are again, sort of on Bruce Abbott's shoulder. He's probably got the fewest close-ups of anyone in this whole movie, because we're always seeing just the side of his head, because we are Bruce in this film. We are Dan Kane. I also have to credit Mac Ahlberg with giving me a crash course in filmmaking and being very patient with me when I would get into arguments with him about screen direction, why someone always had to be on the left side of the screen or the right side or whatever, depending on how the scene had been shot, and the axis and crossing the line and all these terms that I had no idea what they were about. Mac, to this day, we did 4 films together and are about to do a 5th, and I still call him the Professor. Now this scene here, where Dan Kane wakes up from a nightmare, originally we saw the nightmare that he dreamed, and that scene, I think, is included at the end of this disc, which is the first time that it will have been shown to an audience. And this is another sequence that was shot by Bob Ebinger during that first week. And I think this might have been the sequence that cost him his job, because I think they felt that it was too dark, that when we got the dailies back, the print was very, very dark.
West.
It looks like they've really restored it well. You can see a lot of detail here. But I think I was the one that, that was pushing for mood. And coming out of the theater, I didn't understand that sometimes you really have to have a lot more light on a set than you would, if if you're doing it on stage live. Now we're into Mac Ahlberg territory. In this scene he shot, and this was on a set. And again, you can see the difference in the lighting. This is the scene, again, very theatrical, trying to create the idea of a reanimated cat. And there is no real cat in the scene. It's all being done kind of with theater, with acting, the best special effect there is. And so Jeffrey and Bruce are creating the cat for us as an audience. Jeffrey Combs, I should talk a bit about him. Again, he is the one of my favorite actors of all time, and just walked into an audition. Anthony Barneo was casting the movie and knew Jeffrey and known that he had just won an award for a play that he had done. And Anthony knew that my background was theater, so he presented a lot of actors from the theater. Jeffrey and Barbara, and we immediately hit it off. And Jeffrey has been in just about every movie that I've done ever since. It's kind of hard to think about making a movie without Jeffrey, as a matter of fact. But he projects an intelligence and a subtlety, which I think is absolutely wonderful and very, very rare. And read an article about him recently that described him as the new Vincent Price, and I think that's appropriate. I think he's a fine actor.
But my reagent is Reed.
With various animating solutions, I've killed.
I should talk a little bit about the special effects in this movie. A lot of them were done in a very theatrical way. I mean, we were doing this movie on such a tight budget that we couldn't afford optical, so everything really had to be done on the set. And the scene where the cat is reanimated, it's being done with a puppet cat being operated through the table. And the guys who did the effects for this, Tony Dublin, a friend of Bob Greenberg's, and John Nolan did most of the effects. And then when Charlie Band got involved, he suggested we use John Beekler, who had been doing a lot of work with Charlie. So we ended up with all three of them working on the film, dividing up the chores. And I have to say that the effects were simple but effective in this movie. And considering that the last third of the film, you've got a guy walking around carrying his head, so that every shot literally became a special effects shot. It made it very challenging for these guys. Brian was a real stickler for knowing exactly how everything was going to be done, and I remember him going through the movie and grilling each of us, about every single scene over and over again. Now, how is this going to be accomplished? And I did the storyboards for Re-Animator myself because we couldn't afford to hire anybody. And I did have some commercial art background, but gave the boards, worked with the effects guys, with Tony particularly, about how the various things could be accomplished, and then sat down and storyboarded.
Of course. Don't expect it to tango.
Now, the idea of using the glowing green fluid, I think just came from seeing this stuff in a hardware store. It's the sort of thing that you use. They put it in flares, and there's a little capsule inside, and you break the capsule, and the two things mix together, and it starts glowing. And so we used this on the set, but it only had a lifespan of about 40 minutes, so we had to keep changing it all the time. And it was extremely toxic stuff. And as the actors say, they were told not to, get this on their skin or on their clothes, and of course it got splashed everywhere.
Herbert West has affected reanimation in dead animal tissue.
Mister,
And this is Bob Sampson playing Dr. Halsey, and Bob really kind of projects this very, Mr. Normal, Republican, conservative. He's almost like a spokesperson. He reminds me of, Ronald Reagan for GE Theater or something. But this is all kind of a pretext with Bob, because underneath he is one of the wildest, craziest, funniest people I've ever met.
Experiments were clearly beyond the scope of your legitimate studies. They've obviously interfered with your ability to do your classwork.
And he just delighted in playing this movie, because normally I think he was given these kinds of roles where all he could do was be this sort of, the good doctor or the boss, and to be able to play a zombie was something I don't think he had ever been given the opportunity to do before. And he just loved it. It was great. I think he even wore his makeup home sometimes just because he liked it so much.
As of now, he is no longer a student of this university.
Threw himself into a very physical role. And I think, as he says on his commentary, was suffering from a bad back at the time. So it makes it even more amazing.
Don't take this out on Meg. She tried to stop
And again, here's Bruce Abbott doing some wonderful work. Making us understand why he gets into this crazy experiments with Herbert West. The idea that he's lost his scholarship, a big blow. This is the only way that he can prove that what he's doing is right.
You ain't got my lunch under there, have you? Yeah, one meatball run over by a semi. I lost my appetite.
This is the set of the morgue that was built. We shot this on SNA Studios, which was the same studio where Whatever Happened to Baby Jane was made, and also the early Johnny Weissmuller Tarzan movies, and also right before us the movie Terminator was shot here. And a lot of the people on our crew had just made Terminator, and as a matter of fact they went to a screening of it while we were shooting Re-Animator, and came back absolutely amazed, because when they were working on the film they had no idea how well it was going to turn out, and they had no idea what a terrific director Jim Cameron was until they saw the finished piece of work. This set was, as I said, is a reconstruction of based on the Chicago morgue, and it was done by Bob Burns, who was the art director on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and again another friend of Bob Greenberg. I should say that Bob Greenberg is no longer with us. That he was really my mentor on this, and if it wasn't for Bob, I wouldn't be making movies today. But we worked together on this, and he was helping me with From Beyond and Dolls, and was working as a kind of a production guy on RoboJocks. And when he'd gone out on a location scout and was coming back from it, he got a drunk driver driving down the wrong side of the road, plowed right into him, and he was had to be pulled from the car with the jaws of life, and was so badly messed up that so much brain damage to him that he eventually died. It was very, very upsetting. It was like a scene from this movie in a way. going to see him and trying to get him to respond. You know, not knowing if Bob was conscious or aware or not, because they really couldn't tell anything, and realizing how powerless medicine was.
Age early 20s. Physical condition. Deformities. Appears to have been in excellent physical condition.
This is the first time that they are reanimating a human subject, or at least the first time Dan Kane is. And the man on the table who's playing the corpse that they choose is Peter Kent, Arnold Schwarzenegger's body double. And as you can see, he bears quite a strong resemblance to Arnold.
15 cc's of reagent being administered.
As a result of Peter's being in the film, Arnold saw Re-Animator and became a big fan of the movie. And I had the opportunity to meet him. He came over to Empire Pictures, and with all of his bodybuilder friends, and had them. You know, we screened it, Re-Animator, for him there, and afterwards got into the tiny little elevator to go up to see Charlie Band, who had his office on the 4th floor, and all packed into this tiny elevator, and not realizing that there was a secretary who was still in the back who had been trying to get out. And all the guys sort of suddenly turned around and saw her there, and Arnold looked at her and smiled and said, "Let's get naked." And she just kind of like turned into a little puddle on the floor at that point. Arnold, I should also say, was responsible for my getting the directing job on Fortress, which was a project that he originally was going to do. And he recommended me to John Davis, the producer, as a result of Re-Animator. The sequence was inspired, I should say, to a large degree by the artwork of Bernie Wrightson, a comic book artist whose work I have admired for a long time. And the various angles and close-ups and so forth were kind of a sort of an homage to Bernie, who I later got to meet. And he told me that he had seen this movie and thought that, I think he recognized that I was borrowing heavily from his style. I think ripping off, I think, is the word we're looking for here.
Cover him up. Let's go. All right.
Re-Animator was shot in 18 days. And we finished it right before Christmas. And the last day of shooting, we went until, I think it must have been an all day. You know, we went all day and all night. It was 24 hours straight shooting. And by the end of the day, I literally was blind. I could not see. I was driving home, driving back to the apartment I had rented with my wife, and had to pull off the road and let her take over because my eyes just stopped working. But it was great fun working on this movie. Everybody kind of rose to the occasion. There was no complaining. There was no fighting. It was a great experience. A great group. Very hard work, but very rewarding. The scene here of him biting off Dean Halsey's fingers was inspired by something that Bob Greenberg had once said to me, which was that it's the little things that upset you the most. He said, Godzilla stomping on Tokyo is not scary, but cutting yourself shaving is. So the idea of biting off somebody's fingers is a very upsetting image, because you can kind of imagine what that would be like if that were done to you. Now this bone saw thing, this was one of the more difficult, what they call gags in the film. The entire torso built here of Peter Kent, with a couple of effects guys behind it, pushing out hamburger and pumping blood furiously. And Jeffrey Combs literally up to his elbows in blood. And Jeffrey, who had never done a horror film before this, was completely freaked out by this, having so much blood on himself. And that sequence where he shakes it off there is not acting, it's real.
No, you can't be serious.
You may be right.
The idea here also of the way Bruce is playing this, the idea that Dan Kane is in shock here. Again, you know, most movies you see the most outrageous things and everybody just kind of accepts it. In reality, if anything, if you saw any of the stuff like, you know, actually happening, you would probably go into catatonic shock, which is what he's playing here.
Dad, we can bring him back to life. Now, get the recorder. Find my serum.
This is a dream.
Fiction. Here, do this other hand. Oh, good. Unbreakable.
Again, more Bernie Wrightson type angles here. You're moving over the body.
Certainly more durable than this. We need you in the crash room. Coming.
Now, this is maybe an apocryphal story, but if I'm not mistaken, the man who's sitting next to Barbara here, who's got his jaw bandaged up, is Jim Cameron's father. And all the people in the background here are all members of the team and friends of Brian and myself. You know, I came out to Los Angeles to do this movie. Originally it was going to be done in Chicago using the Organic Theater as a soundstage, but the board of directors of the theater were outraged and horrified by the idea that we were going to make what they saw as a B movie, as Organic's debut film, and so they told me that they did not want Organic to really be officially involved with this picture. At that point, you know, all the money was raised and we were ready to go, and I said, I'm going to go do it anyway, and took a leave of absence and came out to LA and directed the film in Hollywood. And after that, after the success of this film, moved to LA, but I've never done another movie in Los Angeles or Hollywood since. All of the films that I've done have been done outside of the United States. So, I don't know why exactly that happened, but that's the way it worked out. This pullback shot was my sort of inspired by my infatuation with dollies, and Mac Ahlberg started calling me Orson Rails as a result of all the dolly shots that we were doing in this movie. You know, I was sort of called on the carpet by Charlie Band at one point, who felt that it was not enough coverage because I was not really shooting this movie in a conventional way with close-ups and medium shots and long shots and so forth. I was really inspired by Polanski, who kept that camera moving and kept kept very, very long takes going. And as a matter of fact, some of the only way we could cover the amounts of pages that we needed to do sometimes was to do really long takes, you know, like theater. And this is an example of one here. This is all one shot, and had to get everybody into it. We'd spend a lot of time rehearsing. The movie was rehearsed for 2 weeks before we started shooting. So the actors really knew what they were doing.
I'm calling the police.
And again, the idea of every man is so shocked by what he's just witnessed that he's literally, you know, passing out here, going into shock. One of my theories about horror movies is that the more scared the actors are, the more scared the audience will be. You know, and you see so many movies where people just don't seem to be scared about anything that's going on. Yeah.
Can't hear you or see you. It's a one-way mirror.
What is wrong with him, Doctor? Can we ever be...
Originally in the film there was a whole subplot involving David Gale's character, Dr. Hill, which was that he was developing the power of the mind, willpower, and was able to hypnotize people and make them you know, do things that, you know, he was able to exert his own will upon them, and which was we were using it as a way to justify his ability later in the movie to have a connection between his head and his body, which were severed. But after, you know, when we first did the first couple of screenings of this, I believe it was Albert Band, Charlie's father, who said that something I felt was very true, which is he said, you've got too many weird things going on in this movie, that the movie should be as believable as it could be, and that the only thing that should be at all sort of beyond reality is the reanimation fluid itself, and that everybody else in the movie should behave as normally and realistically and believably as possible. And so that entire hypnotism idea was cut from the film, although it was reinstated in the R-rated version of the movie, which was put out on video. The R-rated version I should talk about a bit, which was done without my supervision or without Brian's. I think it was Vestron Video wanted an R-rated version of the tape. And what happened was, once the movie was rated R, it became illegal to show the unrated version, which is something that no one ever really expected. And later on, I think Brian had to go back to the MPAA in order to get permission for the movie to be screened at midnight screenings, and ask them to rescind the R rating, which they did. And they said it was the first time in the history that anybody ever asked them to take back an R rating on a movie.
I'm going to take care of him, Doctor. And I'm going to find out what happened to him.
This is another scene with Meg and Dan Kane, and Meg is the only one who seems to realize that what he's doing is a mistake. And I once met somebody who was talking to me about this movie and said that, I think he was referring to some book that had been written about the three sort of major horror movie themes. And they had sort of broken it down to the three sort of classic stories: the Dracula story, the werewolf story, and the Frankenstein story. And they said that the werewolf story was about that within every man is a beast, you know, sort of a sexual out of control creature. That the vampire story is about, it was kind of, these were all sort of Freudian interpretations of these, had to do with having sex with a stranger, someone coming into your room in the middle of the night and making love to you or sucking your blood. And that the Frankenstein story, he said, was a masturbation fantasy. And I said, how's that? And he said, well, it has to do with, the idea of creating life without a woman. And, that it's sort of, what he went on to say was that in Re-Animator, he felt that it was very appropriate that the only one who realized or understood that what they were doing was wrong was a woman who could understand that this was not the way to create life.
What do you want?
I want to know why Halsey's heart fibrin.
Now this scene with David Gale and Jeffrey Combs, I think, is one of my favorite scenes in the movie. This is kind of the battle of the two geniuses, or the real genius and the fake genius. And David, I think, really kind of captures this kind of classic horror movie. The actor, the Boris Karloff or the Peter Cushing quality here. And Jeffrey, I think you could say, is maybe a young Tony Perkins.
I want your discovery. Whatever it is that gives.
But again, you get the sense that both of them realize that this discovery is worth killing for, and that Herbert West really is motivated to do it. The way the movie operates is that in the first half of the film we see West as the main villain. He's murdering, he's killing Dan's cat and causing all kinds of trouble, getting him his scholarship taken away from him and so forth. But with Dr. Hill, we establish an even greater villain, and now suddenly we're on Herbert West's side in this scene. That Dr. Hill is so much worse. That he's going to steal poor Herbert West's miraculous discovery.
Genius, Mr. West. Your extension of that old fool Gruber's work is really quite brilliant.
Has Dr. Hill examined your father?
Yes. Wanted to do exploratory surgery on him.
Shit. He'll find out. Eventually he'll find out.
Let us see.
The scene here where he's looking under the microscope at the reagent at work, we originally in the script had a shot of the showing a cell coming back to life after the reagent is dropped on it, but we couldn't afford it. Probably would have looked cheesy anyway. One of the things I've learned is that an audience will accept very simple special effects if they like the story, if they're involved. And the sequence here, the prop guys or effects guys built a rubber shovel here, and we tried it out in rehearsal, and Jeffrey came up behind him and smacked him with the rubber shovel, and David Gale said, "Ow, that really hurt." Almost knocked him out. So in the scene here in the film, he's not even touching him with the shovel. It's all being done with sound effect and with David's reaction. The scene of the head being cut off from the body with the shovel was really inspired by growing up in Chicago and having to shovel snow and break ice and stomp on it with your foot and so forth. And this sequence with the letter spike was, I believe, Brian Usna's idea. This was not in the original script, but just a piece of business that Brian devised. And again, very, very well played here by Jeffrey. This scene was one I remember. We were shooting this at probably 2 in the morning. You know, we would go very, very late at night. And David Gale was under the table with a hole cut in the table, and in a pan that was filled with corn syrup blood that was dribbling down all over him. And we started calling him the man in the pan. Very unpleasant and very, cramped and not able to move for hours. But again, never complaining. This sequence is my friend Jim Belushi's favorite scene in the movie, where he'll start speaking and West is writing it down. You bastard, he says, and sometimes I get calls in the middle of the night from Jim Belushi, and I pick up the phone and all I'll hear is "you bastard." One of the other themes of this movie was, again, we're trying to get characters that you care about, and so Meg and her love of her father is a kind of a central theme here. That even though her father is a raving maniac, she still is compelled to go into his cell here and see if she can reach him. And I was able to connect with this very strongly. My father passed away when I was a teenager, and often had dreams about him. And as a matter of fact, one of the dreams that I remember having was one in which my father came back from the dead and looked horrible. And I didn't care. I was just glad to see him. When we did this movie, we had Dr. Hill had come up with the idea of a laser lobotomy, and this idea was something that didn't exist when we made the movie, and today it is done every day. Laser surgery is a part of, is a very ordinary thing now, and lobotomies are performed with lasers now. Now this scene that's coming up here was one that was kind of created on the set by the actors, by Bruce Abbott and Jeffrey Combs, who pointed out to me, and it was one of those things that you never really think about when you're writing something, that there was no moment in here where he told Dan Kane what had happened to Hill. And so some dialogue was improvised, kind of created right on the spot for this. And I think it's some of the funniest dialogue in the whole movie here.
Hill took my serum, my notes, everything. Herbert, you're insane. Now what happened? I had to kill him.
He says, I had to kill him.
Dead?
He's dead?
Not anymore.
Not anymore.
Herbert!
Very simple, very quick.
Tried to blackmail me, Dan. No, and he wanted you to disappear.
This is the point in the movie where, up until now, it's been kind of playing pretty much like a straight-ahead horror movie. But from the point where we've got Dr. Hill carrying his head around, the movie starts sort of veering into the more outrageous and becomes more comical as it goes from here. Although one of the things that I learned on Re-Animator was that you can't be funny and scary at the same time. That laughter is the antidote for fear. So that what you can do is you can build tension and then relieve it with the laughter and then crank it up again. But you can't, if you do both at the same time, they cancel each other out. And there were a lot of comic possibilities that suggested themselves with the idea of a head and controlling a body, and the frustrations of this body that can't see, or hear. I also think that somehow in this movie you end up getting some kind of grudging respect for Hill, who, no matter what happens, I mean, the man has been decapitated and he still doesn't give up, and he still goes and steals the reanimation, the secrets of West's reanimation, thinking somehow he's still going to get his picture on the cover of Time magazine. I mean, this is a man who is, never quits. As the other actor said, David Gale had to wear this terrible wig through the movie because we couldn't afford to make a fake head that matched his own hair. So it was cheaper for us to buy 2 wigs that were the same and put one on the head, the dummy head, and one on David. And this shot here that's coming up, where David's face is superimposed over Bob Sampson's, was done with a 2-way mirror and a lighting change. So it's not an optical at all. Couldn't afford them. But those are the best kind of effects, I think, the ones that you do in camera. Now this sequence here with Dr. Hill carrying his head in a bag while he's got this fake head on top was again coming straight from H.P. Lovecraft. This was an idea that was in the original Re-Animator stories, in which the Dr. Hill character has made a wax head for his body, who carries around a little suitcase, a little valise with the head, his own head in it. and a little hole cut in the bag for him to peek through. I think there is a hole in this little gym bag for Dr. Hill's head.
Big time.
This is him gasping for breath because that gym bag probably had like old tennis shoes in it or something. It's really pretty funky. And this idea of Dr. Hill creating an army of zombies was also H.P. Lovecraft's idea. Although I have to say that H.P. Lovecraft does not ever write female characters. So the whole final scene between Dr. Hill and Meg was something that Dennis Paoli came up with. And I remember the phone call from him in the middle of the night with him cackling uncontrollably, saying, I've just created the world's first visual pun.
I guess I'm just getting paranoid. It's just so hard to lose you.
You should go away. Transfer to another school.
Don't worry about me. You're the one I should give away. Go live your life. Find somebody.
I hate you. I want so much to hate you.
The scene again was Bob Ebbinger's scene. He shot this. And again, I think, you know, it works really well. But you can see the difference between this and Mac Ahlberg's work in this scene right here. And I think this is the only optical in the whole movie, which is the laser drill itself. This scene is always the one that everyone remembers from Re-Animator. This is the one that they talk about, and when we were shooting it, I think we all knew that this was the scene. This was the scene that the first actress had quit the movie as a result of. But it was also the scene that was done as a painting for the very first poster for Re-Animator, even before the movie was made. So we knew this was the moment. And Barbara Crampton, again, very, very brave soul here, had cleared the set of all photographers and even the still photographer from the movie. And a few years later, I was with her when we went to a Fangoria convention, and someone brought one of these photographs of her in this scene for her to autograph, and she went ballistic. Where did you get this? And she made the poor guy, take her to the person who had sold him the picture and who had a stack of these things that he must have pulled from the negative of the picture, or not the negative, from print of the picture. And she confiscated an entire stack of about 300 pictures.
Well, you'll be all right.
Meg. Oh my God.
Where? Hurry.
But I think Barbara, knows that this is the movie that really got her known. Put her on the map. And as a matter of fact, the scene of her screaming in here was used. I believe it was an AT&T commercial that used some of the clips of the greatest movies of all time. This scream of hers. She has the best scream of anyone in movies today. The scene, I remember seeing at a screening this, might have been dailies, or maybe a very rough cut of the picture, and David Gale and his wife were there. And when his wife saw this scene, she turned to him and said, "David, how could you?" and stood up and walked out of the theater. But I think later on she kind of realized that this scene also had done some good things for David's career.
Let me go!
And this is the moment here.
I must say, Dr. Hill, I'm very disappointed in you.
And I've gotten into a lot of discussions with people about this scene because sex and horror are two things that have always gone together. It's kind of like salt and pepper. You can't have one without the other. And the monsters, even in the old horror movies, were always carrying off the girl who was usually wearing a nightgown or a negligee. You just never got to see what happened when they got home.
Discovery. Who's going to believe a talking head? Get a job in a sideshow.
Why an intelligent young man like yourself should make
This shot of David was done with him sticking his head through a torso, a fiberglass torso. He's behind the guy, which is why Dr. Hill looks like he weighs about 300 pounds here.
I have a plan.
And here are all of the corpses inspired by the pictures from the pathologists. Some great makeups here. John Buechler did the shotgun head, which he called Gesundheit. And there's a guy with tubes coming out of himself. It was someone that I had seen at one of the morgues. It was a failed operation that they just left all of the surgical gear still in the person. And that fake head is a John Buechler creation, where the eyes could move. And again, these extras, featured extras, all had to perform nude, and were all spray painted with the various lividity and the various colors and so forth of the people that I had seen in the corpses that I had seen in the morgues. And they, as a matter of fact, they started, the makeup guys called them the rainbow corpses, and spray painted them with airbrushes. Now this is the moment, the idea, again, of sort of the central sort of heart of the movie, that even though this man has been turned into a monster, he still remembers his daughter. and the love is still there. And she's able to reach him. And he realizes what's been done to him here by Hill. That turns against him. So this is one of the bloodiest sequences in the movie. We used about 30 gallons of blood making Re-Animator. And as a matter of fact, one of the main things I remember about this movie was that my shoes were always sticking to the floor. And I thought we had the all-time record for the amount of bloodshed until I ran into Peter Jackson about a year ago and saw his movie Brain Dead, or Dead Alive as it was called in the States. I had to ask him how many gallons of blood he used in his movie. He told me that he used 3,000. So I guess that's progress. This was all, this sequence, the tempo of the scene, and I should say the whole movie really, is due to a large part to the work of Lee Percy, the editor. And this section here he worked on for long and hard, and he and Brian really trimmed this back and got it to work so that we have this building sense of chaos and this complete mayhem. And Herbert West being strangled by the intestines was done by shooting it all in reverse and pulling the things off of him. These days we were still concerned about the getting an R rating, and one of the things that we were told was that if you showed a guy's penis on camera, that you would not get an R rating. So we were, through the shooting of all these naked corpses sequences, we had these things for them to wear called merkins, which are basically sort of pubic hair wigs that were going to cover their genitalia, and ended up not ever using them until we got to this scene here with Gesundheit. And the Mac Ahlberg said, I can see his penis. I can see his dick. And we called to the costume department to put a merkin on him, and it turned out that she had thrown them all away. And so we decided that the thing to do was to spray it black, like the Rolling Stones song. And basically what we ended up with was a black penis. This guy here is in the burn makeup, had to undergo. I mean, this is probably a 6-hour makeup that he had to go through. And we chose him specifically because he was an amputee for this scene here. Now, the idea of killing Meg was something that would never happen if this was a Hollywood movie. You would never get away with killing off your leading lady. And the man that you can see flattening himself against the wall, there's Bob Greenberg. And we also passed Ron Berman, who was the doctor from the ER play, and also our medical consultant on Re-Animator. And that's Kim Deitch standing behind my wife Carolyn, who's in the foreground there, who plays the ER doctor. And I think this is one of the few films that I've done with Carolyn where she's not brutally murdered.
The trachea's fractured. Just fixed and dilated.
No response.
King. King.
And now we've come full circle. So the movie ends in the way it started, with Dr. Block, named after Robert Block. I think we called her who was one of Lovecraft's proteges. Robert Block wrote Psycho. And I once saw a screening of this when the audience at this moment all started screaming at the screen, "Use the juice! Use the juice!" This ending, I have to give credit where credit is due, is inspired to a large degree by Stephen King's book, Pet Sematary, with the scream in the dark. Mike Muskal has gone on to become one of the best special effects supervisors in the business. There's Ebinger's credit. Becky Block, who's listed there as a set decorator, came over to me when we were shooting the head gives head sequence and said, "Stuart, go as far with this as you possibly can," which I thought was good advice. And here's Tony Dublin and John Nolan, who were with us from the beginning, and John Beekler, who came on board after we started. They all did extraordinarily terrific jobs. And Judy Zimmerman, who casted the extras, and I was asking for the strangest looking people that she could find, and she certainly found them. This movie was kind of a charmed film. It was a first movie, and I had kind of written off the critics, and the first screening of it for an audience was at the Cannes Film Festival. They had a midnight screening, and the reaction was so intense. I got a call in the middle of the night from Brian Usna, who told me that the audience had just gone ballistic and just loved the movie. And we ended up getting a special critics prize. So the critics ended up loving the film, and Pauline Kael wrote a wonderful review of the movie. It went on and on, and compared Barbara Crampton to a Botticelli nude. So, who can figure? And David Gale, who I will always remember, him coming up to me as we finished the film and said, Stuart, this movie has reanimated me. That my movies were, in my work, I was kind of in the doldrums until this film, and reminded me how much fun it is to make a film, to do good work. And this movie started me on a whole new career and a whole new life. So I guess you could say it reanimated me as well.